Okay, this is the first project for Audio One. You'll find this in Learning Module 2, and then you click on the project panel. And when you open that page, you'll see the video. And of course, if you're watching the video, you've already found it. Okay, so double click on the Audio One Projects One Elements.zip. That should download to your downloads folder. You'll have to unzip it. And when you do, you'll see the contents. The top two items are the step-by-step written instructions in both Word and PDF format, the two audio files we'll need for the project, and then the marked script as a PDF. And these are the notes that I took during the session, and I made edit marks to indicate which takes were the proper takes. I'm going to demo this project in Adobe Audition, which you should have as part of the Adobe Creative Cloud, and it's a wonderful app. If you prefer, though, to use a different app like GarageBand, you perhaps got that free when you bought a Mac, or Audacity, or Pro Tools First, or Pro Tools, or Cubase, or Logic, or any of the others, that's perfectly fine, but you'll have to adapt. But you'll find that's really not that difficult because there's really more in common with all these workstations than there are differences. The menus may be slightly different, and some of the features may be slightly different, but I use the analogy it's like driving a different car. You know, the lights and the wipers are in different places on the dashboard, but you can usually still drive. So the first time you open Audition, you may get this screen. You can close it if you want, or you can watch some of the tutorials if you want. That might be helpful. Also, lynda.com actually is wonderful for this. You guys have a free subscription to lynda.com, and you should take advantage of it. It's a great way to learn. You can have Audition up and be working along with the tutorials and actually learn something. When you close the introduction screen there, you get the waveform editor in Audition. It's kind of unremarkable. There's not a lot of things going on. It looks a little dark. But this is the landing page or the landing screen for Audition. And while the waveform editor in Audition is very useful, we'll be doing all of the projects using the multitrack editor. So you can get to that several different ways. You can click the multitrack button right there near the top left-hand side of the screen, or from the File menu, you can go to File, New, Multitrack Session, or just hit Command-N. When you do, this window will open up. This is where you put the session parameters. You can name the session, and it's a good idea to always name it because then when you output the file, it uses the name of the session for your file, so you don't have to rename it then. So I usually do first name, last name, and P1 or Project 1. I put it on the desktop usually so I can find it. If you have another place you'd like to put it, like on an external hard drive, which I strongly recommend, you can direct the session there. And then you have some other options. For example, template. What templates are, if you do a particular kind of session over and over and over again, you may want to create a template so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do the session. In this course, we won't be using templates at all. We don't need to. We're going to just start from scratch. So leave that blank or none is the right answer there. For the sample rate, you can go all the way up to 192, which is pretty high. Actually, it would be better quality. However, the files that we're going to be editing here are at 44.1 right now, and we're not going to get any better file quality by making this session 192. It's just going to take a lower res file and try to make it bigger. It'll be bigger, but it won't be any better. So keep it at 44.1. Likewise, the files are 24-bit, so we're not going to get any better quality by going to a 32-bit, but just to make it easy for the entire course, we'll do everything at 32-bit. And the output will be stereo, so you won't have to worry about that. Just do everything at 32-bit in stereo. It's only going to make the files about 50% larger, but you don't have to be changing it back and forth. When that's all in place, click OK. The session will typically open in the edit window, and unless you've used a template, you'll get 6 tracks plus a master fader. You can always add more tracks. You can always delete tracks, but they just defaulted to that 6 tracks plus a master fader, which is fine. So now we have to import the sound files into the session. I can do this several different ways. I can literally drag them from the downloads folder right onto the timeline. And in fact, if you're using GarageBand, that's what you have to do. There's no import feature on GarageBand other than simply dragging it onto the timeline. But in Audition, you can also do File, Import, and then Files, or Command-I is the shortcut for that. So go to the Downloads folder where your files are and highlight the 2 WAV files. By the way, you'll notice that they're the only 2 that you can import. The others are grayed out because they're not really audio files. So click OK, and you'll see the files appear in the Files panel, which is typically located in the upper left-hand side of Audition. By the way, if you're not seeing a particular window, you can go to the Window menu and scroll down. They're listed there pretty much alphabetically, and you can find the window you want and make sure it's checked. So next, drag the file Jim_03 from the Files panel onto track 1 in the edit window. Essentially, what we're going to do now is conform what was read to match the script exactly. So at the beginning, he says something like, okay, that's not in the script. So we're going to trim off everything until he actually starts with the first words, people often complain. By the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the reason the files are named Gym 3 and Gym 4 is the way workstations operate. Typically, the tracks will be either called Audio 1, Audio 2, Audio 3, or Track 1, Track 2, Track 3, as they are in Audition. And when you start recording, the first track will be Track 101, Track 102, Track 103, Track 104, etc., the more you record. However, if you rename the tracks initially as the announcer, like Jim or Bob or Tom or Mary or whatever, then the tracks will be named that way. So Jim was a real announcer. His name is Jim Smith. He recorded another project for me, which was Gym 1 and Gym 2. And then I said, Jim, would you mind recording this for my students? He said, no big deal. And so we did 2 more takes, and that's why it's Gym 3 and Gym 4. So I'm going to move down to where he first starts talking there. And you'll notice that you can actually hear, as you move the timeline, you can actually hear the audio. It's a way to scrub the audio and give a check on where you are. So I'm going to put it right before he starts to actually talk. And then I'm going to highlight the file by just clicking on it. It'll get brighter. And I'm going to do Command K to split the file. You can use the razor tool if you want, but I prefer to just do everything with the move tool. That way you don't have to keep switching tools. By the way, the shortcut for the razor tool is R, and the shortcut for the move tool is V. So you could do those on the keyboard too and go between R and V. But I find it's easier just to stay with the move tool. The move tool is kind of like the smart tool in Pro Tools. It's also like the selection tool in Adobe Premiere. Depending on where the tool is on the file, it changes functions. For example, if you're on the edge of the file, it can become a trimmer tool. It can be a selector tool. It can actually move the file, and it can move the timeline. So it's kind of a handy tool. So I'm going to click to highlight that opening piece where he's not really saying anything right before he really starts seriously, and highlight just by clicking on it. Now, if I just hit the delete key, the piece will disappear and everything will stay in place, but I'm going to hit Shift plus delete. And you'll see now that this snugs up against the beginning of the timeline, which is what we want. Next, I'm going to play from the beginning of the timeline, and following the script, I'm going to go down to where the announcer says, why then are commercials so much louder? And I'm going to park the playhead there. And I'm going to hit Command K. But before I do that, let me point out one other thing. There are 2 play modes in Audition, as there are on most workstations, actually. You could have the playhead return to the same position every time you hit the space bar. You play, and when you hit the space bar, it jumps back to where you start. Or you can have it remain where you stopped. There are times when one or the other will be more helpful. In this case, I prefer to have the playhead return to where I started originally. That way I can audition the spot. I can listen to it and say, yep, that's where I want to cut. And then I hit the space bar again, and it's back to that same spot, so I don't have to find it again. To toggle back and forth between those 2 modes, you can hit Shift plus the X key. There's also a preference, but rather than going to the preferences, it's easier just to do Shift plus X, and then you can toggle between those 2 modes. I'm going to split the file by pressing Command K, and then I'm going to highlight the piece that I don't want, which is the outtake portion, and I'm going to hit Delete. I don't have to worry about Shift Delete because nothing really has to move here. Next, I'll drag Gym 4 from the Files panel onto that same track on the timeline, and notice there's some space or some dead air before he starts talking, so I'm going to trim that up. By just dragging the timeline, you can scrub or hear what he's saying when you're doing that. And then at the spot where he starts talking again and saying, why then are commercials so much louder, I'm going to hit Command K. I'm going to highlight the piece of audio we don't want and hit the delete key. That piece will disappear. And then I can click on the Gym 4 file with the Move tool, and I can drag it back until it touches the end of Gym 3. By the way, notice the horseshoe magnet there in the window. That's the toggle snapping. If that's blue, it's almost like a magnet. You can drag it over, and when you get it close, it'll just kind of snap to the end of the file there to the spot that you want. And you don't have to be super careful. You don't have to keep zooming in to make sure you're right. It usually works. So then I'm going to follow the script and look for the next edit. But here's a shortcut. You can look at the waveform and kind of tell where the edits are. And that's because the announcer's focused on the mic when they're reading. They've got their sweet spot. They're professionals. They know how to work. They hold the script and they try to keep their head in the same position. When they screw up or make a mistake, they usually pull their head back and say, I messed that up. And you can see the waveform will get smaller. So I'm looking there. The next edit I'm looking for is the beginning of paragraph 3, where he says the answer depends on whether you're talking about loudness or volume. He does that actually 3 times, and that's indicated by my shorthand there. That actually says 4x3. It looks like algebra, but what it means is it's take 4, but he does it 3 times. Again, there are several different shorthand ways of notating how many takes a person did or whatever, but this is one that I learned years ago, and a lot of people use it, and it's certainly a good technique. I've used it my entire career, and it's worked well. So we know he says this 3 times, and the third take is the one that we want. By looking at the waveform there, I can see you can play it too, and in fact, you should just to hear it, but he did it, and he kind of stops, and he says, "Oh, let me do it again." He does it again, and he messes up again. And then the third time is the charm. And the third take is the one we want to use. So I'm going to do Command K on the first time he reads it, which is the outtake. I'm going to move the playhead down to the third time he reads it. I'm going to do Command K on that again and cut it, or you can use the razor tool if you prefer. And then I'm going to highlight the piece, which is the outtake portion, the portion where he messes up. And I'm going to hit Shift Delete, which will pull those two pieces together. I'm going to go down to the next edit, which is actually a couple sentences later, where he says, "The tree falling disturbs the air." He only reads that twice. That's why it says 4x2 as opposed to 4x3. So I'm going to find the second take. I'm going to mark the first time he reads it, mark the second time he reads it, highlight the piece in the middle, and then hit Shift Delete, which is going to pull those two pieces up. Next, I'm going to go down in that fourth paragraph to where he says, "In the same way as sound outside the frequency range of human hearing." He reads that 3 times. That's why it says 4x3. So I'm going to put the playhead where he reads it the first time, hit Command K, put the playhead where he reads it the third time and do Command K again, highlight the piece in the middle and hit Shift Delete. It'll pull those two pieces together. By the way, if you're working in Pro Tools, the split command is Command E, or you can just hit B if the single keystroke function is active. In GarageBand, it's Command T. In Audacity, it's Command I. The next edit is in the fifth paragraph, where he says the answer is the average volume. And he does that, I think it's 3 times. Sorry about my terrible penmanship, but I think it's 4x3. So we want the third take on that one. Then we'll highlight the piece in the middle, hit Shift Delete, and that piece is gone. Finally, the last edit we need to make there is in that last paragraph where he says there are portions at higher levels. So there he only does it twice. So we're going to do Command K on the first time he says it, go to the second time he says it, do Command K, highlight the piece in the middle, hit Shift Delete, and that piece is gone. He reads on for about another full page, but we don't need that. If you can edit this, you can edit 20 pages. If you can do this once or twice, you should be good. So right where it says is called the dynamic range. We're just going to find that spot. Again, hit Command K. You can hit the backslash key, just like in Premiere, and that'll show the entire session. Then you can select that back portion there that we don't need, highlight it, and hit Delete, and it'll go away. And that should be the entire session. If we did this right, we should be at about minute 55, give or take a second or so. There should be 7 edits, and you can listen to it. It's always a good idea to play it before you export it. Double check. You don't have to listen to everything, but just maybe go back before each edit a little bit and play. Then we need to export this file because right now this file does not exist as an actual file. It's just little bits and pieces of GIMP 3 and GIMP 4. And if you happen to check your project folder, which should be on the desktop or wherever you put it, you'll notice that there's actually no audio files in there at this point. All you have is the .sesx file, which is the Audition application file, basically the EDL. And then you have a backups folder. And what this is your autosave. It's set up in preferences. Typically, about every 3 minutes, it will automatically save to the folder here. And we'll get more into this later, but you can actually, if you want to, rather than saving it inside your session folder, you can save it to the cloud or save it to a different drive. But probably for this course, saving it to the session folder makes the most sense. So how do we get the audio files in there? Well, I'm going to hit save. We haven't saved anything yet. These have just been auto saves. In fact, if you check the date or the time on your original session, it probably is when you created the session. So I'm going to hit Command S, or you can go to the file menu and go File Save, either one, but Command S is quicker. And when I do that, this message will pop up and says, hey, some of these files are not in your session folder. Do you want to copy them? And the right answer is always yes. So go ahead and save. And then if you check your project folder again, you'll see those files are there. So you'll have now everything you need if you want to take that folder to a different computer or finish this project on a different day. You'll have everything you need because until you save it, the GIMP 3 and GIMP 4 are just living in the downloads folder. And you may go back later and delete all your downloads because you're trying to clean up your computer. So again, how do we get this file to a deliverable? How do we export this so it's actually an audio file as we're hearing it here? So the command is File, from the File menu, Export Multitrack Mixdown Entire Session. And by the way, it's always a good idea to hit the backslash key before you do that, just to make sure you see the entire session because you could have something far out on the timeline maybe that you didn't delete. And this is just like it is in Premiere. When you hit the backslash key, it shows you everything on the timeline there. So you should see just a tiny space at the end of the track, but that's what's going to export now. This window will open. Notice it automatically names your file to the name of your session, and it just adds the word Mixdown to it, which is fine. You have a bunch of different format options to save your project in. I request that you do it as an MP3 because I save all of your projects on my computer like forever. I'm kind of your cloud storage here. So the MP3s sound indistinguishable from the waves, and they take up about 1/10 of the space. So anyway, export your file. And then once you've done that, go back and go to the project page, click Submit Assignment, browse your computer to find the assignment. It should be on the desktop, locate it, and then submit it, and you're done.